to the community. What can we do to help promote community revitalization? And before we get started, I want to let people know some of the images in the presentation are very graphic, so if you have to look away or if you have to leave the room, I completely understand. This is something that I've been seeing for over 15 years, and I've gotten used to it. I hope nobody gets a chance to get used to this stuff, because no one should ever get used to trauma and tragedy, but we do have some graphic images in here. So think about this. You're at work and you get called because you have a young 20-something-year-old male who drives himself to the emergency department after being shot in the chest and the upper extremity. He's breathing, he's just in pain, he's uncomfortable. You do a number of different diagnostic studies and you realize that injury across his chest is just a through-and-through injury. Actually, more not even a through-and-through injury. It's just an abrasion, just a kind of a gunshot graze. But it goes through his right arm, and so you do a bunch of stuff to make sure he doesn't have any blood vessels, major blood vessels that have been injured. But this is not the first time he's been shot. So at this point, what do you say? What do you do? We also have another young man, 20 years old. He had some beef with somebody attempted to rob him, and all of a sudden he gets shot in the hand. If you can see right here, this is an x-ray of his right hand. That area in the middle is some really, really light-shaded areas that's shrapnel from a bullet. And you can see that those bones aren't intact. His metacarpals have been completely shattered because of a gunshot wound to the hand. He's got vascular damage, he's got nerve damage, he's going to have to go to the operating room to have this repaired, or else he's going to wind up losing his hand. While you're walking past his room, you see some friends and family of his that are making comments. And they say, we know who did this, we're going to get that mother. And you know the rest. You make eye contact with them, they make eye contact with you. At this point, what do? And so these are questions that I've been asking myself over and over and over again as it relates to violence in my place of work. Because it's cyclical, and when something affects people that are around you, when something affects people that are in your community, you can't just sit by and just act like it doesn't exist. There are many of those who do exist, they just ignore this stuff, but when it hits you really hard, you can't avoid it. But it's impossible to talk about violence, it's impossible to talk about conflict unless we address one key concept, and that's the concept of power. Sociologist Wade Noble said that power is the ability to define reality and have other people respond to your destinations as if it were their own. And you start thinking about that, and it got me thinking about history. And you think about the system of government known as apartheid in South Africa, which is where you have a small minority group misappropriating power to ensure social, economic, and political dominance over the native South Africans. But let's take it up another notch, and let's think about hip-hop artist Nas, Nasir Jones, who's an entrepreneur as well as a hip-hop artist. And Nas rapped, he said, "It's that shit that moves crowds, making every ghetto foul. I might have took your first child, scarred your life, crippled your style. I gave you power, I made you buck wild." And Nas rapped these words when he was talking about the power that came from a gun. But power is kind of funny, because people who are in positions of power are always afraid of losing power, but those who aren't in positions of power are afraid that those who do have power are going to exercise that power on them for not having power in the first place. It's because power is control, power is hierarchy, power is influence. And when power affects every aspect of your life, its presence or its absence can lead to conflict. And that conflict brings about violence. Violence is nothing new in New York. It's depicted in films like Martin Scorsese's film, The Gangs of New York, which was talking about immigrant gangs in New York City at the turn of the mid-19th century, like around 1850. It can be the result of racial and economic disparities, which is part of the story of the rise of the Bloods and Crips, starting out in Los Angeles, California, but then spreading across the United States. It can affect kids who are on their way to nursery and preschool and elementary school. It can affect partygoers, which is what happened with the Orlando nightclub shooting. It can even hit home. This is one of my mentees and close friends, Willis Young. Willis grew up in Bed-Stuy. He lived across the street from where I moved about 5 or 6 years ago. And Willis dabbled in street life early on in his life because of some situations that happened, but he and I worked together on our violence intervention program. He was one of our first hirees. He did extensive and tremendous work doing intervention work for people who've been shot and stabbed, counseling them, doing advocacy work. But on my birthday, July 22nd, 2015, I got a wake-up call around 7 o'clock in the morning. Multiple messages that kept popping up once I turned on my phone. It said, Willis has been stabbed multiple times and he's in critical condition. He was stabbed over 10 times and wound up dying in the Department of Trauma, the same place that he was doing the intervention work in the hospital that we both work in. In the United States, you have over 500,000 reported acts involving youth between the ages of 15 and 24. In the U.S., you have over 5,000 youth-related homicides. In Newburgh, New York, the violent crime rate is 286% higher than New York State average. At my hospital alone, Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, New York, Central Brooklyn, we had over 200 gunshot wounds. We're not talking about stab wounds, we're just talking about gunshot wounds. We're not talking about blunt trauma because somebody got hit upset with a pipe or a bat or a stick. We're talking purely gunshot wounds. It's the number 2 cause of death amongst Latino men ages 15 to 34, but it's the number 1 cause of death for black men ages 15 to 34. This is a problem. When we start looking at, a lot of people look at violence as a pure social problem, but violence is so much more. It is a public health problem with identifiable risk factors, and if we wind up intervening with these specific risk factors, we can hopefully change the scope of violence. Now, people who live in the hood, people who live in marginalized communities, we know that poverty kills. And as a matter of fact, there's a direct correlation between poverty and violence. This is a map right here of New York City. I had some technical difficulties this morning. I don't have the Newburgh map, but it's almost the same thing. The darker shaded regions of the map represent those living below the poverty line. The more lighter shaded regions represent those living above the poverty line. Those darker shaded areas in Brooklyn, New York is where I work. That's the central Brooklyn region. You can see in the Bronx, in the southern part of the Bronx is also very, very darkly shaded. Newark, New Jersey is almost, you have a major, major block. But then if you were to superimpose these maps and put them together, you'd also look at this homicide map from New York City. And those same dark shaded areas of representing poverty also have the highest concentrations of homicide. It's the same in Chicago, it's the same in Boston, it's the same for Newburgh, it's the same in Poughkeepsie. Now the good news is the number of fatal injuries has decreased from the 80s and 90s. And a lot of that stuff is because of change in the crack cocaine wars that many of us had experienced growing up in the 80s and 90s. But the bad news is, for every single fatal injury, there are at least 100 non-fatal injuries, which can be just as debilitating. This is a young man we took care of in our Department of Emergency Medicine. He has a razor blade injury. We're not even talking about gunshots. This is a razor blade injury to the left flank. It's right over the liver, and as you can see, he has what we call evisceration of his abdominal contents. His intestines basically came out of his body, and they were injured. He survived the injuries. He had multiple surgeries on his belly, but think about it. You don't really recover from that. That's not the same gentleman. This is actually a gentleman who was shot in South Carolina after selling less than $300 worth of marijuana. He was shot by police in one of the beach towns in South Carolina. He has what we call a shit bag or a colostomy bag. And imagine, you're 16 years old, you're 17 years old, and this is May, so this is prom season. Imagine, you're going to your prom. That person you've been checking out all year long decides that they're going to go on a date with you. And you're doing a nice slow dance. You're nervous about it because you're 17 years old, but you're nervous about it. And you hug up close, and all of a sudden there's this horrible smell coming from you. There's now a brown stain on your shirt because these colostomy bags leak. Think of the embarrassment that happens. And so when I talk to some of the young people that we work with, that we treat in the hospital, it's like, how come we have all these non-fatal injuries compared to fatal injuries? They go, look, you catch a different case. You can, for certain injuries, you can say, wow, this was self-defense. Other injuries, you get charged with manslaughter, which is a completely different prison sentence. But it's not just there as far as the physical wounds of your abdomen. This is debilitating. This is a gentleman that I took care of a few years ago who had what we call a buck 50 scar, or smiley face injury. He was sliced right up here on the angle of the mandible, all the way across to the chin. He did well, and we call it a buck 50 scar because in the street they say it takes about 150 stitches to close it up. But think about it. Why do people get these injuries? This is only a few inches away from his carotid artery. It's only a few inches away from his jugular vein, which can kill you in an instant. And we're not talking about people who just have bad aim when they were trying to take somebody out. They did that because they were trying to send a message. Whether he was a snitch, whether he did something that people didn't like, but now he's marked for life. So everywhere he goes, anywhere around the United States, people know something happened, people didn't like him. So he's marked for life. This is also not just a physically debilitating thing, it's costly. But I'm going to go back a little bit. All right. You got a gunshot wound. All right, now you got an injury to your belly. You got to wear a colostomy bag. What happens if you get shot in the back, you get shot in the hip, and you were a star athlete, or just somebody who wanted to stay in shape and like playing ball and with your friends? You're 16 years old. You've got an injury to your spinal cord. People have to push you around everywhere. And if you're not confined to a wheelchair, you walk with a limp, which sets you up to be an easy target. You can't run from anybody. If you got an athletic scholarship, people aren't going to take you to their school. Think about the consequences of some of these things that are taking place. Everybody's concerned about the physical death, but what happens when you can't even live, even though you're just walking around? It's like you're the walking dead. But this is a costly process. You got somebody coming in for minor treatment release. It can cost maybe $1,000. You know, this is somebody who gets a gunshot wound to the shoulder. It's a through and through injury. Nothing major injured, or they got a couple of lacerations. You wind up sewing them up. No problem. They get out. Let's say they die in the emergency department. That may cost about $5,000 just for that entire trauma resuscitation. Probably a little bit more now because of inflation. Somebody's treated and they're hospitalized, that can cost at least $25,000 for that hospitalization period. That's not taking into effect lost wages that can come about because of property values that have diminished in the neighborhoods. This is not taking into consideration court fees and judicial costs, rehabilitation costs, mental health costs, physical rehab. Nobody takes that stuff into consideration. But violence affects so many different things. This is $19.5 billion a year in the U.S. is spent on stuff related to interpersonal violence and suicide. $19.5 billion when you're looking at both direct costs and indirect costs. When you have violent incidents that are taking place in your communities, businesses don't stay open. And so you wind up having an immediate impact on the local economy. You don't have a local economy, what are people going to do? Everybody's fighting for these crabs in a barrel. Everybody's fighting for a small amount of limited resources to ensure their overall survival. If you don't have a couple of key things, food, clothing, and shelter, you can't thrive. You're just in a state of survival. When we're in states of survival, we're not always making the best possible decisions. But what we know from our experiences growing up in the community and working in the hospital, we know that violence is recurrent. It's kind of weird. I work at Kings County Hospital. My elementary school is directly across the street from the Department of Emergency Medicine. So there are people that I see that I grew up with that are coming in good shape, some not so good shape. But when you see somebody that you know, it has a completely different impact because you go, wow, that could have been me. Had I not had mentors growing up, family making sure that I stayed on a particular track, and other people, and pure luck, my situation could have been very different. My brother's just coming home from prison. I have a couple other cousins that are still in prison. My family's from New York and also Chicago. And being at Cook County in Chicago, my situation, I always wondered, is my cousin going to wind up coming in on this stretcher? Or some of my cousins going to wind up coming in? And so it has a completely different impact when traumas become personal. So looking at recurrent violent injury is something that many of us have experienced. If you come in shot or stabbed once, that re-injury rate is as high as 44% within 5 years after that initial trauma. Each additional injury increases that likelihood. There's a 20% rate of being killed within 5 years after that initial injury. 20%. If you have any other health problem in the United States where you have a 20% mortality, you'd have flyers, you'd have all this money being poured in, you'd have so many resources, but because the face of violence is often young men of color, and now even young women of color, people don't invest the same amount of money into it. They look at it as a purely social problem, not as a public health problem. Now, who comes in? Who are the patients we see? Who are the members in our families that become affected by this? Who are the people in our schools that become affected? They're young. Some of them are gang members. Some of them have increased exposure to violence. It might be just watching TV. It might be video games. Some people may have easy access to weapons because of purchasing guns. There's a major black market, but you don't even always have to have a black market for firearms. You've got different laws across the United States depending on the state that you're in. You've got different laws if you're a federal licensed firearm dealer that may be very different if you're a gun dealer selling stuff all over the internet. Completely different laws for internet gun sales compared to that of a federal licensed firearm dealer. This is easy access to weapons is a major factor, but also violence in the home. If nobody wants to see their loved one injured because of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. But when you see this stuff over and over and over again, by default, many of us realize that this is how we deal with conflict. You may not like it, but this is what we've been taught. Mental health is a major thing. Just looking at violence, when somebody's been injured because of interpersonal violence, more than 60% suffer from post-traumatic stress disease or post-traumatic stress disorder. The same thing for our vets coming back from the Middle East or for people of other generations coming back from Vietnam or World War II or the Korean War or the Gulf War. So they start to self-medicate. They have nightmares. They suffer from depression. 20% of those individuals will still have symptoms of PTSD a year after that initial incident. But for many of us, do we refer people to mental health services? No. They say tough it up. They say stay out of trouble. But if you already have pre-existing mental health problems, and many of us don't even realize we have a pre-existing mental health problem, dealing with depression, dealing with anxiety disorder, because we don't have easy access to mental health services in our community to begin with. Each trauma just increases the likelihood of you suffering from additional trauma, which also allows you to increase the likelihood of you engaging in certain types of violent activity because you're stressed out. And again, back to the whole thing, when we're stressed out, we don't make the best possible decisions. So one of my mentors is a brother named Dr. John Rich. Dr. Rich heads the Center for Nonviolence at Drexel University. He also started the Violence Intervention and Advocacy program with some colleagues in Boston University. He also helped co-found the Healing Hurt People program based in Philadelphia. And Dr. Rich did a qualitative analysis looking at young black men who have been victims of violence. And qualitative analysis, they basically created these, took stories down and listened to stories of all these young men and started to look at what some of the underlying themes were. And there were three key things that came up as a result of why young people engaged in violence. One was a loss of respect, which falls under the tenets of the code of the street, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, having lack of faith in the police, and also traumatic stress, which we just discussed. But the code of the streets, according to Philadelphia sociologist Elijah Anderson, who's now at Yale, he said that the code of the streets is defined as a set of informal rules which govern interpersonal public behavior, particularly violence. So if someone attacks you physically, verbally, it is imperative that you respond aggressively. If you don't respond aggressively, it's viewed as tolerating victimization, which sets you up for additional opportunities to be taken advantage of. For people who are history majors, for people who are in high school, you think back from world history, this is a modern-day reenactment of the ancient Mesopotamian code of Hammurabi, which is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, except it happens in Newburgh. No different. So this diagram right here just kind of illustrates the cyclical nature of violence. Let me see if I don't have a pointer, but so let's say you got somebody coming in injured. Okay, you get shot, you get stabbed, and what happens when you get injured? Especially if this took place in the front of your apartment building where you live in. If it took place in the school that you go to every day, if it took place in the work environment that you go to every day of the week, imagine what happens to you. You feel scared. You don't want to go back out. These are places that used to be safe havens for you. But now you wind up going home. And because what do we do when we're stressed out and we don't have access to somebody to talk to? We drink, we smoke, we pop pills, we do everything possible because we want to blunt our senses so that we don't think about this stuff ever again. But what happens if you have a mandatory drug screening for your place of work? You fail your drug test. Or if you're part-time and you're only there as a vendor doing per diem stuff, you're considered to be expendable. It's like, smell like weed, smell like alcohol, you're fired. And now that part-time job or the series of part-time jobs that you had just to make ends meet, you can't take care of yourself. Again, 3 things are jeopardized: food, clothing, and shelter. And when those 3 key things that are essential for your survival have been jeopardized, you're going to do whatever it is to do what you need to do to survive, to make sure that you and your family can be fed. And so you enter an illicit economy. You start selling drugs. You start hustling. You start selling shit off the back of trucks like they do in my neighborhood. I gotta hook up with some Ray-Ban sunglasses in Brooklyn. But that's a complete side note, and don't put that in the newspaper. I know we have a gentleman here from Hudson News. But think about that. And then when you wind up having to hustle because you're not in a safe environment, you start carrying weapons. And I think back to my 10-year-old self. I remember the first time I got jumped was when I was 10. I say first time because you grew up in Brooklyn, same thing in Newburgh. This is a rites of passage. You're always fighting. Somebody's always trying to steal stuff from you. These kids jumped me. They took my bus pass. I think I had $1 in my sock or something. But it freaked me out. It took place on the corner of my block. We lived across the street from Fort Greene Projects. And I was scared. So at age 10, on and off to age 18, I started carrying razor blades to school. I carried razor blades, I carried screwdrivers, I never carried a gun, but I'm also lucky I never had to use that. But I was scared because my safety was disrupted. Now, had I, gotten into it, and at least the times I got into it and had a weapon on me, this could be a very different story that we're having right here. Because I put myself in a completely different situation and increased my likelihood of being injured. But you're scared. A lot of our family members are scared. Our kids are scared. Our students are scared. Our teachers are scared. And again, we're scared. We don't make the best possible decisions, which also allows you to enter that cycle over and over and over again. Now, some people may, have different resources, and their families can move them out of the hood. They move them out of the hood in Brooklyn, and they move them up to Newburgh because they think, wow, we got space, there's grass, we got trees, we're right by the Hudson River. But same problems follow us, particularly in areas where you don't have urban renewal, you don't have as in-depth and as innovative economic development. And so we leave the hood searching for other places just so we can be safe, but those same situations tend to find us. Unless, of course, a couple of things. You move away completely and never come back, and you go to a place that's considered to be safe, or somebody dies. Now, the thing is, when somebody dies, you think that cycle stops, but it doesn't stop because now their friends and family always start retaliating because they feel, based on the code of the streets, their sense of safety has been disrupted. And because the laws of the jungle tell you you've got to make sure you stand up for yourself or else you're going to be taken advantage of, that cycle will continue. Now, mass shootings have gotten a lot of they've been kind of popular in the media. From the Columbine High School shooting to the Conyers, Georgia stuff, the Orlando nightclub shooting, the Sandy Hook incident, and countless others around the United States. And the mass casualty shooting is when you have 4 or more people who have been shot that were considered to be completely unrelated. And this is not considered to be gang involvement or the result of a robbery. Now, the face of this tends to be, you start thinking about violence itself, everybody always thinks young black and Latino men. But mass shootings, majority of the perpetrators tend to be white men. close to 60, I think 40 to 60%, maybe white men if you're looking at around the United States. But again, just debilitating. And there was a paper that came out a long time ago that was looking at mass shootings in high schools around the United States. And there were a couple key things that were associated with the perpetrators. You know, I think back to, the risk factors for people who were re-injured in the first place for young black men. Easy access to weapons, doing poorly in school, substance abuse, mental health problems, family problems. This is the same thing for these mass casualty shooters, except for in this paper, they were coming from middle class and affluent communities. And so we got a problem. And the reason why we have a problem is because we're looking at violence purely as a social problem. But violence is systemic, and you got to look at it as this multifactorial approach. It's social, it's political, it's economic, it's health-related. And if we purely look at the physical effects of violence, then we're not going to pay attention to anything else. The cycle is going to continue. Now, you got a couple of things that can happen. I'm an emergency physician, but we have educators in here. How many people work for community-based organizations or work for schools? Okay. Give yourself a round of applause, because this is not an easy task. But I think everyone expects just the role of violence just to be a problem that law enforcement takes on. And I know we have a number of law enforcement officers that are here. This is a community approach. When you have somebody that comes into your emergency department, how many healthcare providers are here? Okay. We got people who've been in the hospital, but nobody knows them. Oh yeah, one person right here. Okay. So when you have somebody who may be a guidance counselor or a school social worker, or works at Mount St. Mary College, and you got a young person that's been injured because of violence. One of the key things you might ask that person is like, one, are you safe? Because you always have to assess safety first. Then you might want to ask, do you think this is going to happen again? So you can assess for re-injury. That's a key thing that we have to do. If you know that there's going to be retaliation that's going to occur, if that person's not safe, our number one priorities are to make sure that they're safe. Then after that, we talk about retaliation, getting additional people on board so we can kind of see how we can do some sort of community-based mediation. But our schools, our emergency departments, our clinics, our hospitals can be ideal situations where that preliminary intervention work can happen. On a most basic level, even if you don't have programs that exist at your hospital, at your school, at your community, in your neighborhoods, everybody's got a smartphone. You can hop on Google and you can Google stuff. There's plenty of resources out there. It might not be completely close. It might not be right here in Newburgh, but you might have something up the street at Fishkill. You might have something in Poughkeepsie. You might have something at Beacon. You might have some sort of cross-pollination where you have domestic violence resources, but you don't have interpersonal violence resources, but it's the same thing. And so they may be able to maybe a point of contact. And right here, what we're doing right now is advocating for policy changes and programs. There's a concept known as trauma-informed care. How many people have heard of this concept before? Okay, there are a few. Trauma-informed care is a multi-systemic approach to violence. It is, in medicine, we look at it as a biopsychosocial model of healthcare where you incorporate everything from the physical aspects of the care to the mental health and wellness aspects of the care. But trauma-informed care revolves around a couple of key things. Again, back to that concept of ensuring safety, emotional management, the mental health support services, talking about loss. A lot of times you've got a shooting that takes place in a community, whether it's in Istanbul, whether it's Antalya, Turkey, whether it's Newburgh, Fishkill, wherever it is around the world, and people go, wow, I'm so sorry, sorry for your loss. Peace out. Nobody talks about how that person is doing or feeling. They check in with people during the time of the funeral, maybe a week after, but that mental health stuff, those community check-ins that a lot of our families can provide, that stuff stops because we go, oh wow, this is something that takes place. It is what it is. That's what we say. It is what it is. And then we go back about our business without realizing the long-term impacts of unchecked mental health problems. And last but not least, making sure the future is okay. If you had a manual physical labor job, blue-collar job, and now you can't work, how do you provide for your family? What are the alternatives? What does that mean? If you were an athlete and they're still giving you a scholarship even though you can't play sports, How are you gonna adapt? You're 17 years old and now you can't run around like the rest of your classmates. How do you adapt to that? And so this is this multi-systemic approach. Now, there are a lot of different programs that are out there. You know, it's like Steve Harvey has some stuff on TV. They have scare tactics programs, gun and buyback programs. There are these self-esteem programs. How many of you all know about some of these programs that exist? Okay, that's all well and good, but they're completely useless because they don't prevent violent injuries from happening. They don't affect recidivism long term. They make the people who put these programs in place, they make them feel good, but I'm tired of feeling good. What good is feeling good for you if it's not having a long-term impact? You're looking at immediate impact and not long-term impact and strategy. So programs that are effective are programs that help provide practical, tangible skill sets that, you know, I was talking to the gentleman from Mid-Hudson News, and skills that are going to focus on job training. They're going to allow young people and older people to adapt to a new economy that's changing, particularly when you don't have a blue-collar economy anymore in your town. I was born in Buffalo, New York, but raised in Brooklyn, and I went to medical school in Buffalo. And in Buffalo, I left when I was 1 year old, but I went up there for medical school, and it used to be a community that looked good. When I went up there, it was a ghost town. There's no factory, and nobody made they didn't make a transition from a blue-collar economy to a white-collar, additional other type of economy, and so there were no jobs. And when there are no jobs, businesses closed down because you don't have anybody to support it. McDonald's closed in downtown Buffalo when I was in medical school. McDonald's, which stayed open in the worst neighborhoods on the planet, but it closed down because there was no economic opportunity. So rethinking a lot of this stuff as it relates to job training, but also paying attention to the mental health and mental wellness aspects. Family training, pre-parenting. Now, we have a hospital-based intervention program, and hospital-based interventions have been done really well across the United States at preventing recurrent injuries from occurring. You've got a team approach as opposed to this isolated, just one person doing everything else. You've got an entire team dynamic. You can screen. Hospitals have different resources, particularly social services that some of our other institutions don't have. Because of frustrations of what we were seeing with violence in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, and my experiences working in the hospital in New York and Chicago and around the world, we put together a team and we created a hospital, school, and community-based violence intervention and prevention program called KAVI, which is based in Brooklyn, New York, but hopefully we may come up to Newburgh. Councilman and I have been talking about this. But everybody has ideas. How many of you all have ideas every day? Okay, how many of those ideas leave your head once you leave the bathroom in the morning? Okay, yeah, we all have that stuff. How many of you all have these ideas, but you think you need to have financial resources to develop these ideas? We all think like that, and I thought like that for a long period of time. But KAVI, I've been doing youth programming and youth intervention work since I was in high school, for mentoring and programs and learning about curriculum and volunteering. I've been doing that